State regulators are now setting the compliance pace. For a long time, compliance teams at multi site operations could build their programs around a single operating assumption. Federal standards set the floor, and as long as you met them, you were in a defensible position. That assumption is breaking down in ways that are catching a lot of organizations off guard. State environmental and occupational safety agencies have been expanding their enforcement authority for years. What is different in 2026 is that federal deference has created a vacuum at the national level that states are actively filling. The result is a compliance landscape where the question is no longer whether you meet federal standards. It is whether you meet the requirements of every state where you operate, on timelines that no federal program has historically required. For compliance leaders managing facilities across multiple jurisdictions, that is a fundamentally different problem than the one their programs were designed to solve. The divergence is real, and it is accelerating. The Environmental Council of the States has tracked a consistent pattern of states expanding independent enforcement authority over the past several years. California, New York, New Jersey, and Washington have each moved enforcement timelines and penalty structures materially beyond federal minimums in areas including air quality, chemical exposure, and hazardous waste management. More significantly, they are enforcing on their own schedules without waiting for federal direction. The practical consequence for multi-site operators is a compliance program that may be fully adequate in one state and meaningfully deficient in another, with no clear internal visibility into which facilities fall into which category. The ASSP's 2026 Corporate Listening Tour report addressed this directly, finding that regulatory fragmentation is now a primary governance risk requiring board-level attention, not just operational management. The report framed governance explicitly as a determinant of EHS outcomes rather than a background administrative function. Documentation standards are not uniform, and that gap is costly. One of the most immediate complications of state-level divergence is that documentation requirements are inconsistent across jurisdictions. What satisfies an inspector in one state may be insufficient in the next, even when the underlying compliance activity is identical. According to the Environmental Law Institute's analysis of state enforcement patterns, documentation deficiencies are among the most common triggers for escalated enforcement responses at the state level, precisely because they signal to inspectors that a facility is not operating with active compliance management. Organizations running centralized documentation systems, calibrated to federal requirements, are finding that state inspectors are asking for records in formats, timeframes, and levels of specificity those systems were not designed to produce. That gap does not constitute a violation on its own, but experienced compliance professionals know it creates inspection friction that can escalate quickly, particularly in states where agency posture is already aggressive. Penalty structures are widening the financial stakes. The states with independent enforcement authority are increasingly strengthening their oversight, according to Pew Charitable Trust's research. They are adopting higher maximum penalties, shortening correction windows, and expanding the categories of violations that qualify for elevated enforcement action. That has happened largely independent of what federal agencies are doing. For compliance leaders making internal budget cases for EHS investment, that divergence is concrete data. A state-level enforcement action in a high-scrutiny jurisdiction now carries a materially higher financial consequence than it did 3 years ago. The math on what proactive compliance infrastructure costs compared to what a state enforcement action costs has shifted significantly in favor of the former. The workforce gap makes this harder to manage. There is a compounding factor that most discussions of state enforcement divergence do not address directly. Navigating multi-jurisdiction compliance requirements is precisely the kind of nuanced, site-specific knowledge that takes years to develop and that disappears when experienced staff leave. The ASSP's 2026 Corporate Listening Tour report found that new employees in high-hazard environments typically take 12 to 18 months to reach full compliance proficiency. That number has a specific consequence in a multi-state enforcement environment. An inspector from a state agency who arrives with requirements your team is not fully familiar with will find the gaps your most experienced staff would have closed before the inspection happened. The report also identified a promotion readiness problem that amplifies this directly. Workers are being elevated into EHS leadership roles based on technical skills rather than compliance maturity, leaving facilities with decision makers who may not fully understand the jurisdiction specific requirements they are responsible for. In a federal enforcement environment, that gap is manageable. In a state environment where agencies are actively looking for noncompliance, it is a liability. What compliance programs built for this environment look like? Organizations managing multi-jurisdiction exposure well have restructured their compliance programs around a few consistent practices. They have mapped state-specific enforcement postures explicitly, identifying which facilities operate under the most aggressive regulatory environments and treating those as priority sites for additional internal scrutiny. They have built documentation systems capable of satisfying multiple sets of requirements without requiring staff to manually navigate the differences. And they have formalized jurisdiction-specific knowledge transfer before experienced staff depart rather than after. The ASSP report found that organizations treating workforce instability as a permanent operating condition rather than a temporary disruption consistently perform better on compliance outcomes. That finding applies directly here. A compliance program that depends on institutional knowledge that is quietly walking out the door is not a program built for the enforcement environment of 2026. The question worth asking before Q2 inspection cycles begin. The compliance environment right now does not reward programs built around federal uniformity. It rewards programs built around a clear understanding of every jurisdiction where the organization operates and the specific enforcement posture of the agency responsible for each one. For EHS and compliance leaders, the question is not whether your program meets federal requirements. It is whether it meets the requirements of your most aggressive state regulator on that regulator's timeline. If the answer to that question is uncertain, the uncertainty itself is the risk worth addressing now. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.